Okay, so now on to my favorite story in the Old Testament. I'm so excited. There was a family, a different family, totally different. They were living in Ramathan, something like that. So the dad's name was, I'm going to call him the husband. The husband's name was Elkanah, and the wife's name was Hannah. Now, unfortunately, okay, so fortunately, Elkanah was a steadfast believer. He believed in God. He knew that he was a sinner. He knew that he was forgiven. At this time, the Israelites, well, everyone, but the Israelites too, they were sinning in a very specific way. What they would do is the guys would not just get married to one lady, they would get married to more than one ladies. So that was sinful. And Elkanah was doing it too. Um, he was a believer and he tried to serve God, but he did sin, and this was one of them. And this sin, as sin often does, it causes a lot of problems. So Elkanah married Hannah, but he also married a lady. I'm going to try to pronounce her name. Peninnah? Peninnah. I'll say Peninnah. So he married these two ladies. Well, back in those days, if you were a woman, you were a married woman, and the big accomplishment that you could be, people would really respect you if you had a lot of sons. Okay, well, Peninnah had a bunch of kids, lots of kids, sons. They were grown up, they were strong, and they were going to be able to provide and make big families. But Hannah, God had not allowed her to have any kids, so she for years and years and years and years, she didn't have any kids. And so she was really sad about this. But the thing that made it way worse was the way Peninnah treated Hannah because of this. So year after year, Elkanah, Peninnah, I'm going to call her Penny. Is that okay? Penny and Hannah would make a trip with all the family, so all the Penny's kids. They would make the trip to a place called Shiloh, and Shiloh was where they had set up. The Israelites had set up the tabernacle. Remember how they used to travel with the tabernacle when they were wandering in the desert? Well, now they had been able to set it up and make it a real nice place where it could stay, and people would travel there. So the family, Elkanah and his family, would travel there year after year. And for whatever reason, Penny thought it was hilarious to use that time on their journey. And then when they got to the temple, I'm going to call it a temple because it was kind of more permanent now. She would use that time to rip on Hannah, make so much fun of her, tell everyone around, oh, Hannah doesn't have any kids. I have all the kids. Look at my awesome kids. And Penny would just make Hannah feel terrible. Well, one year, it was just exceptionally terrible. And Hannah was sitting there at a meal with the whole fam. And Penny just she just laid into her in front of everybody. It was really embarrassing. And Hannah just kind of she kind of pulled away. She started weeping, and she wouldn't eat. She was just so down, so depressed. And Elkanah came up to her and he's like, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why are you so downcast? And he's like, please just eat something. You've got to be starving. But Hannah just couldn't do it. So she kind of went away by herself in the temple, and she started praying to God. And there was the priest. His name was Eli. He was kind of sitting out by the door of the temple, so he could see Hannah, even though she was privately, away and praying to God. So Hannah was just so. She was in such anguish that she was her mouth was moving. She was praying, but just in her heart. So no sound was coming out. She wasn't saying anything out loud, but she was just praying and praying and praying with her eyes closed. And she was just pouring her heart out to the Lord. And Eli came up to her and he's like, "Woman, why are you drunk? Stop drinking. Get rid of your wine." He thought that she had been drinking too much because of the way she was like praying, because she was so into it and in such anguish. And side note, that kind of shows you the state of Israel at this time. Like, they didn't have a king. Remember how they had like judges? So Samson was a judge, and remember like how Samson was as a person. So people in Israel were just doing whatever they want. Like, they were just like doing whatever they wanted. Any sins, if they didn't feel like worshiping God, they didn't. If they didn't feel like doing the things that they knew God wanted them to do, they didn't care. So Eli just figures, well, this lady's drinking in the temple, like she must be drunk. And right away, Hannah's like, no, 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 no. I'm not drunk. I actually haven't had any wine, any beer. I'm just praying because my soul is in such anguish. She just explained to Eli, like, I'm just pouring my heart out to God. And so Eli, he probably felt kind of bad that he had accused her of that. He's like, oh, you're like, go in peace. May the Lord grant you what you've asked for. So Eli didn't know what she was asking for, but he said, may the Lord grant you what you've asked for. Okay, well, it's getting good, my friends. So Hannah, Elkanah, and Penny go back to their hometown. They make the trip from Shiloh back home. And lo and behold, guess what God does? He gives Hannah a kid. So Hannah gets pregnant with a little baby boy. And I'm going to tell you part of the prayer. I didn't really explain to you what the prayer that Hannah said was, but she said, when she was in the temple, she said, Lord, if you will give me a son, I will raise him up not only to be a believer in you and to follow you, but I will actually give him back to you so that he can serve you and do your work. Like, I will give him up so that he can be a blessing to your kingdom, to all people, all Israel. So she made that promise, and she was like serious, like, I'm going to give him up back to God if God grants me a child. So when sorry guys, there's so many little details I want to tell you. So the baby was born, and she called him Samuel, and the name Samuel means God has heard. So what she was saying is, God has heard my prayer. God was listening, and he said yes. So God has heard. And right then and there, she's like, I am giving my child back to God. So what she did is she raised him like she had before she could like give him back to God. And what that means is she was going to actually travel back to Shiloh, go to the temple, find Eli, and be like, Eli, here you go. Here's my kid. He's going to work for you for free. He's going to do all the work you need him to do, and you can train him so that he can also be someone who brings God's word to everybody, like a called worker, basically. And so she like diaper trained him, whatever that means, whatever they did for that in Israel. But she like, made sure he like grew up a couple years old. And when he was 5 or 6, they made the journey back to Shiloh, and she found Eli. And she's like, Eli, do you remember me? She's like, I'm that lady you thought was drinking too much because I was praying so earnestly. Like, hey, it's me. Guess what? When I was praying, God, I was asking God for a son, and look what he did. He gave me a son, and I promised God that I was going to give him back to him, back to God. So here you go. Here's my son Samuel. I want you to have him do the work you need him to do. And remember, he was like 6 years old. So, and I want you to have him do chores, whatever he can do until he gets a little older. And then, as you're training him in God's word, he can do these big things for Israel. So what's next? Okay, yeah. So he was like 5 or 6. And when Hannah like said her final goodbye, she just rejoiced that the Lord had done this for her. So instead of being like sad or selfish and like, saying, oh, I can't give my kid up, or, that wouldn't be fair. She just rejoiced and said, God, you have been so good to me. Here's my kid to do service for you. And so time went by, and every year, once a year, Hannah would come back and she would have made Samuel like this really, really nice robe because, you know, he was growing up. So he was getting bigger and bigger. He needed bigger robes. So every year she would see him, she would give him this robe. So as Samuel was growing up, Eli had two older sons, and there was a little bit of a problem. It was a big problem. Eli's sons, Eli had kind of spoiled them, and like they would do stuff that was not good, and Eli like wouldn't punish them, like he wouldn't discipline them, he wouldn't like tell them like you guys got to stop, and they were becoming like a really, really bad influences, but Samuel wasn't taking part in what they were doing. Samuel was like listening to what his mother had taught him until he was 5 or 6 years old, and then he was really taking it seriously what Eli was showing him. And so he was working so hard as he grew up. So he was like 12 or 13 years old now, okay? And the sons, Eli's sons, were just doing things that like everybody in Israel was finding out about, and it was putting God's name in like major, like people would look upon God as not good because of what these sons were doing. It was really bad. So one night, Samuel goes to bed. He's lying there, getting some good sleep. And in the middle of the night, he wakes up because he hears someone calling out his name. Samuel, Samuel. And so Samuel, like he was in a room that was like different than where Eli was. Eli, by the way, was like 90 years old by now. He was getting pretty old. His sight was kind of going bad. So Samuel jumped up out of bed and he ran to where Eli was. He's like, Eli, you called for me. What do you need? And Eli like woke up and he's like, no, I didn't call for you. Samuel, go back to bed. So Samuel went back to bed, fell asleep again, a second time. Samuel. So Samuel wakes up. Okay, Eli must be calling me this time. So he runs to Eli's bedside and he's like, hey, you called for me. And Eli's like, no, I didn't call for you. You can go back to sleep. So Samuel goes back to sleep a third time. Samuel. Samuel pops out of bed. He was just such a faithful kid. He like, Eli, what do you need? And Eli's like, oh, I know what's happening. He's like, Samuel, the Lord is calling you. Next time it happens, if it happens again, here's what you have to say. Say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel goes back to bed. And one last time, Samuel. And Samuel wakes up and he's like, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Can you imagine that? Like the Lord was speaking to him in person. Okay, so he said that, and this is what the Lord said. He said, I am going to do something that will make the ears of all Israelites tingle. And what he was like saying is like, this is going to wake them up. Like, remember, Israel was like living in so much sin right now and unbelief. And God wanted to call them back, to get them back to the true faith. So he's like, this is going to be big, Samuel. Listen up. First step. He said, Samuel, this is what you need to do. You need to, in the morning, wake up, tell Eli that he has to face judgment, that he has to pay for what his sons have been doing. Because Eli did not discipline his sons. He was serving me as a priest, but he was not taking the sin that his sons were doing that were awful, shameful things in front of the Lord. He didn't do anything about it, so he has to pay for this. So Samuel was like, okay. And the Lord left, and Samuel tried to fall back asleep, but it did not happen. His mind was just racing because think about it. He was like 12 or 13 years old, and he had to tell this man, Eli, who he respected so much. Eli had been so kind and just taught him so much, and he knew how much Eli loved the Lord. But Samuel's like, okay, I'm going to do it because God told me to, but how am I going to do this? So he just lied there wide awake until dawn. And he got out of bed when it was morning. And Eli saw him, and Eli's like, Samuel, what did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything. Don't keep anything a secret. So Samuel was like, okay. And he told him everything. He told him how much judgment was going to come upon Eli. He told him how serious this was going to be. And as hard as this was going to be for Eli, and how sad it was going to be for everybody involved, this was Eli's response. I love it. Eli said, he is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his own eyes. So Eli had faith. He knew he had messed up. He knew that he did deserve judgment. And he also knew that the Lord was going to bring good from it. And he also ultimately knew that he was forgiven, and that even though he had sinned in this awful way, that God has forgiven him, and he was going to go to heaven when he died. So he knew that judgment was coming, and it was scary. It was scary. But he didn't lose his faith because he knew God was so good. So Samuel had done his first job as a prophet. If you remember what the word prophet means, it's just someone who brings God's word to other people. And in those days, a prophet was someone who literally heard God tell them something, and then they would go share that with all the people. So this was Samuel's first act as a prophet. And then, so as Samuel grew up, the Lord kept appearing to Samuel over and over again. And Samuel would share whatever message God had given him with the people of Israel. And the people really respected Samuel. They recognized he was a man who just believed in God, and he followed God. And what he was saying was going to happen was coming true. And you're going to find out about what happens to Eli and his sons next time. But all Israel respected him. And finally, the Israelites were going to be delivered from the Philistines. Now remember, Samson, the last judge they had, he had rescued them from a huge part of what the Philistines were doing to the Israelites, but the Philistines had not been wiped out, so they were still killing by the thousands these Israelites. So finally, Samuel was going to be the prophet who was going to get things started and finally completely get the Philistines defeated so that the Israelites could go on serving the Lord. And that, my friends, is the story of Samuel and Hannah.